Hi, Roy here, and I've just reorganised my Ballantine Adult Fantasy books into chronological order. So thought it'd be good to have a look at those. These were books that came out between 1969 and 1974. Point I'm going to make is that buried in this battered set of old books are examples of pretty much every kind of fantasy that we still see being published today. So, the Ballantine Adult Fantasy Series on these two shelves. They start with the blue star here, but as you can see, there are sort of precursors. So, let's just run through the so called precursors. Mid 60s, Ace Books brought out The Lord of the Rings, but it turned out they didn't have the rights to do so, so there was a bit of a fuss. And then Ballantine Books brought out authorized editions of Lord of the Rings and other Tolkien books. And this was really huge part of the Tolkien craze kicking off in America. So Ballantine, first legit publication of Tolkien. Then, trying to do a bit more, they brought out E.R. Eddison's books, The Ouroboros, fantastic story. If you can hack the archaic language, it's fantastic. Followed by his Zimiamvia trilogy. Bit weirder, a bit more difficult, but riches in there if you can persevere. And sticking with big trilogies, Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy as well. They also did David Lindsay's strange mystical odyssey, A Voyage to Arcturus. And then moving into the realms of more modern authors, Peter S. Beagle's Last Unicorn, fantasy classic. And they dug out his first novel from 1960, A Fine and Private Place, a guy who lives in a graveyard and hangs out with the ghosts. So they did all of that. Then enter Lynn Carter. So Lynn Carter, pulp novelist, super fan, begins to show his scholarly side with Tolkien, a look behind the Lord of the Rings. What's happening with the focus? Okay. So, yeah, Lynn Carter's Tolkien book. So, all of this had happened. Ballantine making out like bandits with their Tolkien stuff, tried a few more fantasies, and they thought, let's have more of the same. So Lynn Carter becomes editorial consultant, and they publish, I think it's 69 fantasy books over the next few years. Right, so Ballantine Adult Fantasy, nice unicorn logo. All of these have introductions by Lynn Carter, which are fantastic little bits of writing. He's such an enthusiast. He's like a sort of circus barker standing outside the tent and ushering you in. And no matter how archaic or difficult the contents of the books, he makes them sound like the most fantastic things ever. So they started off The Blue Star by Fletcher Pratt. Oh, right, so this tour is going to be spine only, because if I start showing you the covers, we'll be here all night. But consider it like a request show. Anything here you want to know more about, want to see more, stick it in the comments and I'll do something in the future. So, Blue Star, bit of an odd choice to start with. It's a sort of alternative history where magic works. But then the next few there, getting into authors that would be published several times in this series and are, seen as really influential in fantasy. So Lord Dunsany, King of Elfland's Daughter, fantastic novel, beautiful, magical, followed by William Morris, The Wood Beyond the World. So Carter's theory is that imaginary world fantasy, epic fantasy, starts with William Morris. And that would be like ground zero of fantasy as we know it. Moving on, James Branch Cabell, The Silver Stallion, witty, erudite, comic fantasy, I guess you'd call it, involving all sorts of mythologies and sort of ironic happenings through mythological realms, by an author who used to be very famous, also controversial. So there's a lot of cabal in this series. Also a lot of fantastic typefaces. Look at these beauties of 70s typesetting. Okay, George MacDonald's Lilith. Again, mystical, spiritual writing. Very total. If people were thinking, I liked Tolkien, let's have some more, they're in for some pretty strange journeys, but good stuff nonetheless. Obviously, at this point, reprinting existing stories. Then we get a couple of short story collections. Dragons, Elves and Heroes is old stuff. Epics, ancient tales, translations. So it's almost like if this was a course in fantasy writing, this would be like source material. And then the companion one, The Young Magicians, is short stories by fantasy writers, including the other ones who have novels in the series, and various others, including Lynn Carter himself. And we get a bit more cabal, Figures of Earth, The Sorcerer's Ship by Hannes Bock. I love this mainly for the introduction. It's a real brief snapshot of a kind of eccentric bohemian life in New York that the author lived. Land of Unreason, Fletcher Pratt again, Elsbrey de Camp, more comic fantasy. High Place is more cabal. Lud in the Mist, now, by Hope Mearleys. So this was a rediscovered but obscure at the time novel. If all they did was to publish Lud in the Mist, the whole thing would be super worthwhile because it's fantastic. At the Edge of the World, that's Dunsany again, short stories, which is probably his main fantasy form. Fantastes, more George MacDonald. Then we get a Lovecraft collection, The Dream Quest of Unknown Cadath, which is his fantasy stuff, and it's his Dunsanian fantasy. So you can basically see how the young Lovecraft, inspired by Dunsany, was publishing these beautiful dreamlike stories, totally unlike the cosmic horror that you get later. Another Weird Tales writer, Clark Ashton Smith, Zothique. That's one of his one of the lands that he wrote about. There are other Ashton Smith collections, and it's they're organised by place, basically, place and time. The Shaving of Shagpat by George Meredith is a sort of Middle East setting fantasy with a fantastic title. The Island of the Mighty of Angeline Walton. This had been published before. It's a first of a series of fantasies that are retellings of Welsh mythology, the Mabinogion. So bringing that to a new wider public, and then publishing new stuff by her. Interesting point. So taken as a whole, lots of old guys, lots of 19th century stuff being reprinted. But when the series publishes new work, then it tends to be from female authors. E.g., next one, Catherine Kurt's Doreen Rising. This was the first time she'd been published, and she went on to have a long career writing fantasies in this series. And I would say what you're seeing here is a really early example of the kind of fantasy where people speak in a recognisable, almost semi-modern way. So, before your David Eddings and all that, you had Catherine Kurtz. More Morris now, The Well at the World's End, 2 volumes, super epic. Golden Cities Far, collection of short stories, one of many with a lovely title. Moving down, second shelf. Beyond the Golden Stair, Hannes Bock, his other big fantasy novel. Powell Anderson comes in with The Broken Sword, fantasy or sword and sorcery classic. William Hope Hodgson, The Boats of the Glen Carrig. So it's weird fiction, and there are strange lands in his maritime supernatural stories. We're getting pretty far away from Tolkienian fantasy, but if you take sort of the idea of an uncanny environment as the test of whether it's fantasy or not. I guess they sort of qualify. Bit more Lovecraft, the doom that came to Sarnath, in effect mopping up his other fantasy pieces. More Cabal, something about Eve. Joy Chant, another first-time publication. I would say what we're seeing here is an early example of YA fantasy. Red Moon and Black Mountain, fantastic. More Smith, Hyperborea. More Dunsany, Don Rodriguez, that's a novel. Way back to the 18th century with William Beckford's Vathek, a kind of Arabian setting Gothic piece. Odd one, this. The most difficult, most expensive to find, but, you know, who needs two kidneys? The Man Who Was Thursday, G.K. Chesterton. Then we get Evangeline Walton's sequel, carrying on her Welsh stuff, Children of Lear. More Cabal, Cream of the Jest. Another short story collection, New Worlds for Old. Odd one, this, The Spawn of Cthulhu. It's a collection of Lovecraft and others writing Cthulhu mythos stories, a companion piece to another non-fiction book by Carter that's not in the series. Seems odd to include it under the adult fantasy banner, but there it is. Double Phoenix, 2 stories about phoenixes, Edmund Cooper and Roger Lancelyn Green. So a feast for Phoenix fans. Water of the Wondrous Isles, another lovely William Morris. F. Marion Crawford's Kaled, another Middle Eastern piece. I believe this was famously low selling. The whole thing was a bit of a personal project for Betty Ballantine, kind of letting Carter do his own thing. But, you know, eventually the low sales kind of scuppered the whole enterprise. H. Rider Haggard and Andrew Lang, The World's Desire. Wish I was showing you the cover, it's fantastic. Helen of Troy in Egypt. What's not to like there? Clark Ashton Smith from Zickarth. C.J. Cutcliffe Hines' Lost Continent, that's an Atlantis fantasy. More short discoveries in fantasy. More Cabal, Domne. Then we see Ernest Brammer, Kai Lung's Golden Hours, in a kind of fantasy China that never was. Very enjoyable if you can be inoculated against the inbuilt Orientalism of the whole thing. Catherine Kurtz, Durini, also not set in Wales literally, but a sort of alternative fantasy Wales. So there's a kind of Welsh undercurrent to these, with the Evangeline Waltons as well. Beyond the Fields We Know, more Dunsany. Arthur Macken's The Three Impostors, set in contemporary times. I'd say if you're looking for a highly influential piece of new weird writing, this is it. And yeah, kind of unclassifiable Macken. Then we get more Hodgson, The Nightland, spread over 2 volumes. Now, if you struggled with the archaic language of E.R. Eddison, that's like training wheels compared to The Nightland. But if you stick with it, it's a wild ride, and certainly has its fans. It's a rite of passage to make it to the end. Song of Rhiannon is more Evangeline Walton. Great Short Novels of Adult Fantasy 1, pretty clear what that is. Evernoor brings together some short pieces by George MacDonald. You should read the introductions of Carter. There's such a bromance between him and, retrospectively, between him and George MacDonald. He basically thinks he's the best man to have ever existed. Orlando Furioso translated a sort of chivalric epic. The Charwoman's Shadow is another novel by Dunsany. More great short novels of adult fantasy. The Sundering Flood by William Morris. Have you got The Sundering Flood? No, it's just the way I walk. Imaginary Worlds by Lynn Carter is a critical work. It's his history and theories of how fantasy is put together. And Poseidonis, Tales of Lost Atlantis from Clark Ashton Smith. Excalibur by Sanders and Liebenthal. Interesting piece that, set in modern day in America, where Arthurian myths are kind of replaying out in modern times. So it's that kind of story, which we'd see again in the work of people like Tim Powers. Hyderini, Catherine Kurtz. Well-loved piece by Paul Anderson, his translation of Hrolf Kraki's saga. More Haggard, People of the Mist, Lost Race story. More Brammer, Kai Lung unrolls his mat. More Dunsany, Over the Hills and Far Away. And that is the last of the Unicorn's Head branded adult fantasy series. But they brought out the fourth of Evangeline Walton's series, Prince of Anwin, so that sort of counts. And Merlin's Ring by H. Warner Munn must count as well, because there's an introduction by Lynn Carter that still talks about the fantasy series as if it was a going concern. So that's pretty much the end point. So, the Ballantine Adult Fantasy Series. Like I say, requests welcome if you want a butcher's at the covers or in-depth chatter about any of the books. Hit me up in the comments. Do not send me an email with the subject line adult fantasy. Okay, thank you very much and good night.